Hi everyone, I'm Matt O'Neill and I'm here to talk to you today about the story of Genesis chapters 4 through 11. So, there's three main themes that come out of this section. There's the deteriorating relationship between humans and soil. Um, and the reason for this theme, one, is that the name Adam from Adam and Eve actually comes from the Hebrew word Adam, meaning humanity or human. There's also Adamah, which means taken from the soil. So there's one of the narratives in Genesis is how Adam was created by God breathing life into soil. But because of the broken disobedience the promise from God with humanity is broken by disobedience. It says the soil is cursed because of you, chapter 3, verse 17. The death of humans, at their death they return to the soil, chapter 3, verse 19. Cain is cursed from the soil, chapter 4, verse 10 through 11. The soil won't produce for Cain, and he has to wander earth east of Eden, and this parallels his parents' story at 324. So there's also, aside from that, the divinely ordained separation of the divine and human realms, and we see this because when Adam and Eve eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they become like gods, and because because God wants that separation between the divine and the human realm, he kicks them out of Eden because by eating the fruit, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they become like gods. Chapter 3, verse 22. In chapter 6, right before Noah's flood story, we have the sons of man, or excuse me, the sons of God, who are angels, and human women having intercourse or having romantic relations. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And it violates that boundary. We also have the Tower of Babel, chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. So humans are building this tower up into the divine realm where God's kingdom is. God wants to stop that, so he says, nope. Going to make everyone speak different languages, and that's an etiology for why people speak different languages everywhere, but it also establishes that separation between the divine and the human realms. There's also the progressive corruption of humanity is the third theme for this section. So, very much like how in the garden there's the disobedience of eating fruit that leads to the first murder, the building of the first city by Cain's increasingly violent descendants. The flood also doesn't solve the inclination of the human heart and the evil tendencies from youth. We see at Genesis chapter 8, verses 21. And part of this might be proven because even after the flood, Noah gets drunk. Just a thought. So there's a ton of genealogies, both J and P, put in here that sort of connect the different stories. Because you can tell in each story that there's multiple tellings of the same idea, the same narrative, same ideology. But so, another thing we notice about this, it's a common thread that parallels other ancient Near Eastern religions, is the long lives of the individuals. So, Enoch lived his life for 365 years. Lamech lives to the age of 777. 7 was viewed as the perfect number. So it actually says, even though Lamech was worse than Cain, his behavior was worse than Cain. Whatever Cain had delivered onto him, the person who did it to him would be punished sevenfold. With Lamech, it was 77-fold. So God puts a worse punishment on a person who does worse than Cain. I'm not sure how that works out, but anyway. So Noah, for our purposes, lives to be 950 years old. His father or grandfather, Methuselah, lives to 969, and this quickly diminishes until Terah, who lives to be 205. So these long lives, and this all continues until Moses, who is alleged to have lived to be 120 years old, but no more long lives after that for some reason. So this parallels the Sumerian kings list, which is dated to the early 2nd millennium BCE. And in this, it's divided into a before and after the flood story, which is another point we will come to in a minute because there are other parallels to the flood story in the Bible. But so it parallels the flood, the these parallel the these instances parallel the ancient Sumerian kings list, where it says, in Eridu, Alulim becomes king and ruled 28,800 years. Alalgar, 36,000 years. There's 5 cities, 8 kings, and they all ruled for 241,000 years. There's a flood, a king whose name we have lost. It's been erased from the inscription has been lost. He rules for 1,200 years. Then there's several others who rule for a few hundred years. Then Uruk, Gilgamesh rules for 126 years. And then the patterns change from about 30, 16, 9, 8. So fewer and fewer, more realistic numbers in terms of an actual length of time that someone may have ruled. So when we get to the flood story in chapter 6, the J author uses Yahweh. Yahweh initiates the flood due to his regret over humans' negative behavior, how evil they become. Only Noah finds favor with God, and he's instructed to bring 7 pairs, not 7, not 2 of every animal, but 7 pairs. That's 14 animals, and they have to be clean if they're going to get 7 pairs. Excuse me. If the animals are unclean, they can only get 2 of every pair. And this is because there's a sacrifice that Noah performs after the flood, and he uses the clean animals. They wanted to make sure there were plenty of clean animals still alive after the flood. So there's a reason for this. So we're already seeing this distinction between what people very commonly know the story to be and what's actually in the writing. So another reason it's important to study these texts. So there's also anthropomorphisms. God shows Noah and his family into the ark. He also closes the ark door. When the sacrifice happens after the flood, the odor that reaches God from the sacrifice is pleasing to him. So there's very human-like characteristics to God in this story. Also in this story is the release of 3 doves. The first 2 come back. The third one does not return, which tells Noah and his family that there is dry land and they should be able to leave the ark, even though they should be able to look out a window and see that. So, the P author uses the same terminology in the P creation story, chapter 1, verses up to chapter 2, 4. So God is, in this instance, also annoyed with humanity. He's referred to as Elohim. There's human corruption. There's violence. Noah walks with God and is given detailed instruction on the building of the ark. He brings his family and only 2 of every animal, male and female. And there's no sacrifice after the flood because there were no sacrifices before the time of Moses, at least according to the P author. So the flood is caused by fountains of the great deep. The windows of the heavens open. This is chapter 7, verse 11. So as opposed to the J narrative, this one lasts a full year. So we're actually seeing a crisscross, a sort of meshing of the 2 different stories that people are understanding. So 40 days and 40 nights comes from J. The full year comes from P. It ends with the renewal of creation and the winds over the earth. And as opposed to 3 doves, Noah lets out a raven. And they are also told, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. The only thing that people need to realize while reading this is to a specific group of people, a very small group of people. It's Noah and his family. Because, like with Adam and Eve, who also received the same command, chapter 1, verse 28, to specific people. And why? Because there were no humans in the Adam and Eve story. In the Noah flood story, all of humanity had been wiped out, so it was really up to a select few people to refill the human population, which logically still doesn't make sense because there's inbreeding and all sorts of gross stuff going on there. But anyway, moving on. So the Duggars are wrong is what I'm trying to say. They can now eat meat, apparently. We see this at chapter 1, verses 26 through 30, where it's prohibited, and chapter 9, verse 6, where suddenly they can eat meat now. God makes a covenant with Noah by putting his bow up in the sky. This is a parallel to another Near Eastern tradition that the warrior or war god took his weapon and put it up in the sky, which is what we would see as a rainbow, to indicate that there would be no judgment or ill will brought upon all of humanity. So, the Gilgamesh epic is a parallel to the Noah story. It's told by a character named Unapishtim. He's one of the first ancient Near Eastern uh, writings that we had deciphered in the 19th century. 1872 is the year. Uh, it was originally thought to prove Noah's flood, but other ancient Near Eastern traditions were found with similar characteristics, which predate when the Noah flood story would have been written. So we know it wasn't that it proved it, there are just similar stories along the same lines. So in both the biblical and non-biblical passages, there's a number of different characteristics that fit this flood story narrative. So there's the divine anger. The hero is warned by God of the flood. There's detailed instructions for the boat that's to be built to save them. They're told to take their family and animals aboard. The boats rest on mountains after the after the flood, and the hero, the protagonist, releases 3 birds when the flood is over. So parallels with the Gilgamesh flood and the Jay narrative are so close it's assumed that they knew of the same tradition in the past, or knew of the same story that influenced their stories. So there's also the Utnapishtim story, Ziusudra, Atrahasis. The earliest copy of the Atrahasis epic dates to 1700 BCE, which predates ancient Israel by about 5 centuries. In the Atrahasis epic, which another parallels Enuma Elish, the patron god Enki escapes in a boat. There's a sacrifice after the floods. The gods say humans can continue to exist, and the population birth control through population is provided a means of birth control through either infertility or infant mortality. In Genesis, we see the anger of an ethical deity that had human corruption, and the biblical writers are drawing on ancient, widespread traditions. They're also trying to explain why something like that wouldn't happen again, and why people would not need to fear God, even though they've told such a horrific story. So the flood story is myth. It's acknowledged as myth. It's not something that really happened. So Ken Ham building his Ark Encounters Museum should take note. There's no geological evidence to suggest that any such thing has ever happened. The bow in the clouds, like I was talking about before, the rainbow is a reminder of a promise. The Hebrew word bow is the same as bow and arrow. So the storm god that I was talking about before set his weapon in the clouds, never to be used again. Genesis 1 details Yahweh as the same storm god, primeval, chaotic sea deity. That's what I was talking about before, and that's all I've got for you today. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something. I apologize for coughing so much. I'm getting over a cold. Please subscribe. Follow me on Twitter at MWONEII. Check out my book, You Say That I Am Jesus and the Messianic Problem, and I will hopefully see you again.